Good evening. Welcome everybody to another Wednesday night interview. So this evening, we're really fortunate to have Zenshin Dillon. Dillon, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here.
Dillon, in addition to being a Zen priest, is one of my cohort mates at the Dharma Realm Buddhist University. So Dillon, I'll just read your biography real quick. So Zenshin Dillon has been on a journey of Zen Buddhist practice for close to 20 years, during which he has deepened his understanding and commitment to the teachings of Zen. Along the way, he met his root teacher, Shohaku Okumura, and was ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest in 2018 at the San Francisco Zen Center. He continues to practice and study with teachers in the Zen tradition, furthering his knowledge and skills as a Zen priest. In addition to his training and practice in the Zen Buddhist tradition, Zenshin Dillon has also pursued interfaith Buddhist chaplaincy studies under the guidance of esteemed teachers Gil Fronsdal and Paul Haller. He's devoted himself to providing service in hospice and prison settings, reflecting his commitment to serving others with kindness and empathy. Currently, he is furthering his studies at Dharma Realm Buddhist University, where he also holds the position of campus life manager and assistant chaplain. Through his diverse experiences, Zenshin Dillon seeks to explore diverse Buddhist traditions and integrate their wisdom to develop a holistic and well-rounded approach to spiritual growth, service, and personal development. So, everyone, feel free to put questions in the chat, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, and maybe at 6:30 or so, we'll go to some of those, so be able to answer and respond to some of your questions. But just to start with, Dillon, how did you come into these robes? And what do these robes signify?
Well, I think we can start by looking at, for myself, it was an interesting path, I think, for me. I think it led from a career in music into a place of kind of wondering, both internally and externally. And several years of that led to a deeper question of, what exactly, how does one live a life that is sincere, upright, and captures a certain essential element of exploration, of curiosity into life. And for me, it was, well, how do I do that? How do I get closer to that question? And it took several years, probably a decade or more, to really look into what that really meant for me, and it led to receiving the Bodhisattva precepts and receiving the robe and the Okesar Kashaya from my teacher.
Am I remembering correctly that did you start off with somewhat of an affinity to Japan before you were interested in Buddhism, or how did you come to Zen in particular rather than all the other flavors and types of Buddhism?
That's an interesting question, because I think that one of the first Buddhist texts that I read was on Theravada teachings, and I was looking at different sections of books in the bookstore one night, and just seeking answers to some of these questions that I had, and I came upon this book that just articulated so well a lot of the places that I had visited and within myself, but also visited as a form of what is suffering was one of the questions. And I think that in itself, that to me is not even, that's human. That's not even Japanese or any sort of tradition. It goes at the heart of at least it went to the heart of where I was, and I began to look into that more, and I stumbled upon Zen at the time I was living in San Francisco, and I stumbled upon Zen just by seeking online, looking for meditation places. And I ended up at Sokoji Zen Center, which is in Japantown. And I sat there for several years with it's most of the time it was just myself and the abbot. And that was a wonderful experience, very fruitful experience, just sitting with him. And then he didn't speak English well, so a lot of our time, a lot of our conversations were in silence. So I got to learn a lot from him, and he returned to Japan several years later after the 2011 tsunami that occurred. And his father passed away, so he returned back home, and I never really seen him again. I've never really encountered him again. So I hold him in my heart, though.
And I would find that quite difficult to have a teacher who I couldn't really speak to and ask questions to. Did you mentioned coming across Buddhist books, and having known you for some years now, I know you do have like a strong love for certain Buddhist literature. At that time, like early in your coming to Buddhism and meditation and Zen in particular, were there certain texts which were helping to guide you, like parallel to your just sitting quietly with your teacher?
Not necessarily. I was just absorbing anything that was speaking to that place within myself. How do I look at suffering? How do I practice with suffering? What is suffering? What is the path to the freedom from suffering? All those questions, they were being, I was devouring some of these texts, and I had no context or any sort of background to know what was Japanese Zen, or what was Japanese Buddhism, what was Buddhism from other countries and other regions. So I had no idea. It was basically what was at the time speaking to that place that was seeking answers, and that didn't really matter at that point. At some point, when I started to practice at Sokoji, I began to sort of like discover that Buddhism has many different sort of backgrounds, so to speak. Is a multifaceted, multi-jewel. It's like a multi-jewel pearl or multi-jewel sort of object, which within itself it reflects a lot of different traditions. And so we can look at Buddhism from the Japanese tradition, from the Chinese tradition, from the Indian tradition, and they all tell you something very similar, but in practice itself, it looks a little different. And so Japanese Zen for me, just to get back to your question, Japanese Zen for me gave me a life practice. Basically, it said, well, if you want to really study that, it's not going to be through words. It's going to be through experiencing what it is to have a little bit of freedom from that suffering. And so one aspect or one key element of Zen Buddhism is Zazen or meditation. And that's sort of the Dharma gate for Soto Zen, at least in that tradition where Buddhism is experienced through the practice of Zazen.
And you talk about coming to find like a life practice in that tradition. And I'm curious, what does it mean to be a Zen priest? Because I know we haven't mentioned it yet, but you're married, but you're also, wearing robes and shaved head. I think a lot of people won't be familiar with how that works.
So what is a Zen priest?
Yeah.
Well, a Zen priest originally, when we ordain as a Zen priest, we receive we take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the ordination is a very very much the symbolism or the structure from where a Zen Buddhist priest sort of leaps from into a life of practice. So it first starts with taking refuge. Then then we receive the 3 pure precepts, which is, I vow to practice all virtuous actions. I vow to abstain from wrong actions or actions based on ignorance. And I vow to live this life for the benefit of others and succeeding lives, as many as it takes. And a lot of it is with the background. So those were the first 6. There's 16, but I just want to pause and say that a lot of that is with the background of with the Four Noble Truths. A lot of them, all of that is supported by the fact that we understand that there's an existence of suffering. Then we receive the 10 grave precepts: I vow not to kill, I vow not to steal, I vow not to misuse sexuality, I vow not to lie, I vow not to intoxicate myself or other, I vow not to slander, I vow not to praise myself, I vow not to cover or be greedy, I vow not to harbor ill will, and I vow not to disparage life. And there's many translations, different translations for the 10th, which some are translated as vow not to disparage life, and others are
To do what? To
disparage life.
disparage life.
Yeah. The more traditional one is not to disparage the 3 treasures. That is the Dharma, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Once we receive those, the practice is to internalize the spirit of those 16 bodhisattva precepts. And that is where we take on the 4 bodhisattva vows. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them all. And Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize. The question, the interesting question has always been, is just like, well, how do you do something that doesn't have an end? Like, beings are numberless. How do you do that? How do you? And it's a wonderful question, because that's the very question that fuels our life of practice. It's endless, so therefore there's no beginning or end. It's something that, with that inspiration, the bodhisattva aspiration and inspiration, through that we structure our life with that as the background. And so we move forward into our lives with that wish.
Yeah, it's interesting. We may have talked about this before, but it's somewhat of a famous saying by Ajahn Chah or Luang Por Sumedho that he says that the one thing why I came to Buddhism is because I'm looking for something that has an end, like nothing else. You just seek and follow your gratification after gratification. Whereas, like with Buddhism, or at least Theravada Arhat path, there is an end. So, but that can become, pathological. It's just like you're always looking for an end, and you're just like, okay, I got to get my seclusion, escape this situation. My end is over here. So I can see the present moment, like being okay with something not having an end or such a vast vow. I mean, having never taken such vast vows, I can only imagine like what that does psychologically over time.
Yeah, I think another aspect of that is the practice of zazen that supports the practice of meditation, Zen meditation, that supports this inconceivable wish. The practice of zazen, through the practice of zazen, we over prolonged periods, and that I don't mean in just one sitting, I mean over years, we begin to internalize and deeply understand to some degree that we are existing as interconnected interbeing. And so that's usually depicted as in Mahayana teachings or in Zen teachings as well. It's the notion of Indra's net, where it states that there's an infinite net that covers the cosmos, that covers in universes, endless universes, and it expands and it extends infinitely. And in every vertex, there's a diamond, there's a jewel. And the jewel is multifaceted, so you can actually, depending on how you're holding it, it reflects whatever's holding, but it's also reflecting everything because of the way that it's cut. And so when we look at the way that is depicted, is that when we actually hold and study one jewel, we realize that actually by holding one, we're actually holding the rest of infinite number of jewels. And so each jewel from the perspective of Indra's net, each jewel, each one of us, and we are reflecting each other infinitely. And we're interbeing, we're inter-existing within each other. Just as a jewel, it doesn't reflect just on the surface, it penetrates the jewel itself. And if we study it, meaning if we look at ourselves, I think this is the teaching, if we study ourselves, if we look at ourselves, it could be, in Zen is through the practice of zazen or meditation, but it could be a dharma, it could be a different dharma gate for different people. But through Zen, we begin to realize, or we begin to sort of penetrate that at some point that this jewel is a precious jewel, because when we study ourselves and look at it very closely, we're not just looking at ourselves; we're looking at the entire relational, interconnected aspect of our lives, and that creates this sort of container for those bodhisattva precepts and bodhisattva vows to take shape from that perspective. So we hold the idea, or the wish is to hold this expansive view, and in zazen and meditation, and then through our social engagement, through our engagement with the world, the bodhisattva precepts is what leads that. So it's almost like it's completely relational. That's the two sides of the same coin, basically. So we have the inner work and we have the outer work, and they're simultaneously working together.
Wow. Maybe could you give a little bit of background on actually what one is doing in Zazen? Like does Zazen, does it just mean just sitting, or am I thinking of a different term? So what are you doing? And I could imagine someone hearing this description that you gave, which sounds very exalted, and just wondering how one does that, or how you're creating an affinity, or with everything, how you're creating or seeing interbeing through just sitting.
Well, I've read this recently, and I thought it was a wonderful depiction of Zazen. They didn't call it Zazen; they called it something else. But I thought it was a great description of it. And the person said, when we sit in Zazen, I'm going to sort of paraphrase and put my own words into this, but he says, when we sit in Zazen, we basically, let's just start with this. How do we experience life? We experience life through our senses: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, right? Or 5 senses, and then the mind in Buddhism, right? And all of our experiences come and go through the senses. When we sit in Zazen, we kind of corral the senses into a very narrow space. So basically what happens is that the senses have nowhere else to go. So our experiencer, we can only go inward because the senses don't have that sort of character anymore, quality anymore, to go out seeking. So basically by sitting in Zazen, by sitting still and quiet, what we're doing is actually reversing the mechanism of our habitual tendencies and the nature of our sense of identity. We reverse that in Zazen because it's not going out anymore. We reverse it and we see what is actually being experienced in its most intimate form, which is just the passing of the sense of identity, passing and falling away, passing and falling away, passing and falling away. Now, the actual practice is that we neither negate nor embrace nor attach to any sort of phenomena that arises within the mind. We allow all that content that is the content of self-identity to come and go. And where does it come and go? Where does it go? Where does it come from? Well, that's the mystery, but that's also the beauty that is actually occurring all the time in our experiences. It's just that through periods of prolonged time identifying with certain content, we've given rise to the idea of identity. And so in Zazen, when we begin to, with those hardened areas of our mind begin to dissolve a little bit, when we begin to become a little bit more softer and flexible, what we experience is something rather, what do you say? There's a lot more space in that experience than just a very, 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 excuse me, very limiting experiences of reliving that content over and over again.
Just me.
That's no
self-space.
Yeah. So in Zazen, we learn to. It says Dogen, Eihei Dogen, a Japanese. He established the Zen tradition in Japan. He says we take the backward step. we take the backward step and realize the essential self, which means that we realize that which is at the core of our existence, and we experience the world no longer from our sense of identity as a very fixed. It doesn't mean that we don't exist anymore. That it doesn't mean that. What I think it means is that we're no longer activated from the sense of this is me and this is how I am, and this is what I like, this is what I don't like. But actually, we're kind of expressing the totality, to some degree, the totality of our lives by not reacting from the place of self-identity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I feel like there is a Theravada version of this, basically the third satipatthana, the third foundation of mindfulness, mind knowing mind. And it's a different language. Like you said some things there about like going back to the essential self or the true self. And I feel like there are things in Theravada which point at something, mind knowing mind. I think it's a bigger conversation. I want to maybe shift over into, so once having taken your ordination as a Zen priest, you have gone on to do Buddhist chaplaincy. I think maybe some people will have heard this word, chaplaincy or Buddhist chaplaincy. And I know for you that's involved doing hospice work and doing work in prisons. And I'm curious if you could describe, what is that? What is Buddhist chaplaincy?
Well, Buddhist chaplaincy is caregiving. It's caregiving work. We need training to be able to actually. So the people that go to these places have had some formal training.
Places like the Sati Center.
Yeah, places. Yes, exactly. But I also mean like clinics and hospice settings and prisons. And interfaith typically means that we go into non-religious places, such as the military, such as hospitals, such as prisons and universities. So I feel like I've been fortunate enough to really had the opportunity to be in several of these areas. I've worked in some of these areas, and I continue to do that. But so what do? We engage in kind witnessing. So basically, we develop through practice. We develop a sense of deep listening, or a practice of deep listening, and we have we practice modeling Avalokiteshvara, which is the Bodhisattva of compassion, and her main practice is really tuning in, listening very deeply to be able to understand what the appropriate response is to some suffering or some question. So what is the response? And so, what is the skillful response? So we strive to follow after her practice. And one of the ways that, that we do that is, one of the active ways that we do that is, for example, I'll share a story of mine when going into a hospice setting. One of the first times that I visited was, how do you prepare to go into someone's room before you knock when you first visit. You go to the main desk, but then they tell you, okay, well, please do your rounds. And so you go into each room and pay a visit to each patient. A lot of the times the doors are closed. So basically you're going into, what are you going into? How do you know how to prepare? How do you know what tools you need? How do you know? So a lot of this can be actually honed down to one single phrase, and that's have a beginner's mind, a don't know mind. Of course, for that, you still need some tools. You still need some training to be able to do that. But I remember one of the first times that I knocked on someone's door, it's like no answer, and then I knocked again, and then I kind of opened the door, and I looked in, and I clearly I saw why I didn't hear an answer. This person laying in bed, and and the person couldn't speak. They were just laying there. And one of the motto at that clinic that I visited was, "No one should suffer alone." And so, having studied that, having known that as a background, I realized that, well, what can I do here except for just sit in zazen?
And this is hospice.
This is
people
hospice.
Close to death.
Yeah, this is very, very. It could be any minute, could be any day. And so, what that day, what my practice, or what the practice was, that I thought was an appropriate response, was just to listen and breathe together. Even though we couldn't speak to each other, it was just breathe together. And it's a wonderful thing, because I spent several hours just doing that with this patient. In fact, I think that was the only patient that I saw that day. And it seems on the surface that nothing happened. Like, I didn't do anything. I should have done more. What could I have done? Like, what? Of course, I think those questions are quite normal that they come up, but and I can't really say that anything super magnificent kind of turned out either. I can't say that they were somehow fireworks when I exited the room or something. But there was a palpable sense of peace in that room, and it wasn't contributed for me. It wasn't necessarily contributed because of. I think it was just that deep connection of breathing together. And the non-judgmental mind, and the non-fragmented experience, but just really tuning in together with breathing together, I think is one of the practices that I've sort of been enriched by, and that comes from the practice of Avalokiteshvara. And so maybe not that content, but the practice itself, the essence of the practice itself, is essential to that caregiving role. So
there's a sutta in the Pali Canon where Sariputta is talking, and he says he's talking to the Buddha, and the Buddha actually tells him, Sariputta, you should train yourself thus. I will be one who is composed of mind and who's composed of body. Being composed of mind, being composed of body, I will thus by that give a gift to others. And I feel like you really do that. The first couple years, so I've known Dillon now for 4 years, and the first 2 years we were on Zoom all the time together, and it was a little bit intimidating. Dillon has such composure of body. Like, sometimes you wouldn't know if, like, your camera, if you just had a photo of you like on the screen, or if it was actually you. He just sits like a rock, and it's interesting. I mean, you've mentioned just sitting in silence with your teacher, or just sitting in silence with this person who's close to death, and it really does something. It's not just empty words to say that something is being conveyed, or there is a teaching that's going on there. So just wanted to share that with other people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is Avalokiteshvara's qualities is to have an open, inclusive, and dynamic heart. Open, inclusive, and dynamic heart. Open in that it accepts things just as they are. Inclusive is that we have faith, we have trust that everything is already part of us. So therefore, there's no reason to go into this shouldn't be like this. Why is this person like this? And the third is that her quality is dynamic, because she's able to respond in myriad ways. And that apparently that deep listening, and this is written throughout. I mean, this is written a couple 1,500 years, I think, ago. That maybe a little more than that Avalokiteshvara became such a prominent figure in this way. And so if we practice with that deep listening, it's possible that we might encounter some of those and realize and begin to understand deeply some of those qualities that I think she's developed these over lifetimes. It's her soul vow to do this lifetime after lifetime. So it's a wonderful wish that as Zen priests or Zen practitioners, that we can sort of follow in those footsteps as we go forward into this type of work.
So we'll go over to questions in just a moment, but I'm curious if you could just say maybe one thing about your prison work, how you've taken this open, inclusive, dynamic heart into prisons. I mean, that's a place where one would think you want to be closed and keep to yourself, guarded, and the most static. And
Yeah, so that was, I do have to be completely honest with it. This has been one of my most challenging sort of areas of work as a person, as a practitioner, as a person that's working with vows. And I mean, it sort of challenges the very core of your being. It's such the acute level of suffering within one place at one time that you cannot turn away from. It does something to you internally. I think it does something to you. It shifts things around. It moves things around in kind of ugly ways. But then it realigns itself in some other strange way, and you somehow begin to have confidence in what you're doing. But the first few times, it was actually very, it was kind of intimidating. But I think, to answer your question in a more succinct way, I think I was asked to be sincere, straightforward, caring, and direct all at once. And that is not something that I learned the first few weeks. That is something that I realized that I needed to somehow internalize within myself, because I kept meeting those same resistances to those things.
Sincere, caring, unique,
straightforward. Yeah, straightforward and caring. Yeah. So that's what I would say to that. But of course, I think in practice, like anything else, becoming familiarized with the environment. So I kept visiting and visiting. That was sort of became my vow to keep visiting. After a while, somehow all that sort of neutralized and began to feel more natural, even though the challenges themselves didn't really necessarily go away.
Gosh, well, we're going to go to questions from all of you now. And yeah, there's so much we've touched. We've only, skimmed the surface of a lot of these things. So please ask questions to go deeper. So first question, this is from Ajahn Kovilo, my co-monk up there. He says, "Good to meet you, Zenshin Dillon. Very happy to have you meet the community." So I agree with that. Other sadhus from other people? So this is a question about zazen, I believe. So is there not a point of focus when internal distraction appears in zazen? It is just to self-study in a way? Thank you. I had the same question. Yeah, what if you're not holding on to anything? What do you hold on to?
That's a great question. Yeah. And that's the very heart of zazen. In fact, that question is very poignant. It's very targeting at we're always seeking something. We're always seeking something. When is it that we just rest? When is it that we just rest? And one of the things that I can relate to is that some patients in the hospice settings, at the clinic that I was working in, a lot of the patients, I realized that after some time, would go from hospice, and I would say a good percentage of them would go from hospice to respite. So if you don't know the difference, is a hospice, when you go into hospice, you're near death.
Like 6 months, or
I mean, it could be less. It depends. It depends on the gravity of your illness or whatever it is. Respite is when actually you're beginning to heal. You're beginning to come out of that sort of path of death, and you're beginning to heal. And a lot of the time, I realized that the caregivers that I met at this clinic were actually somehow practicing this presence with patients. And somehow some of these patients really connected with that and began to come out of these darker kind of death places and began to see sort of a new life. It was really interesting thing. So it's like, when do we stop seeking outwards and just rest and heal? And we realize that actually there's a fearlessness that arises out of that. It isn't just sitting and nothing and nothing happens. At the core of that, there is something that is completely supporting your entire life. But unless we realize that, and unless we stop seeking sort of solutions or results to something, will we actually experience that wholeness that is completely at the core of our being.
So I think that's a very good answer in terms of the meditative complication of distraction is just coming back to a stillness or coming back to a rest. But what about with like sluggishness? Because with that, if one tells oneself, okay, I just need to rest and just be still with this, I mean, sloth and torpor is just going to like collapse you. So how do you in a zazen pose relate to these, lethargic and kind of downward sinking emotions?
I think there's a conventional sense of rest which I think we're using now, and then there's the nature of resting, which means that you do everything. There's a Dao De Jing, everything is done, but we don't know who did it. And so there's another term is Wu Wei, non-doing, doing non-doing. So it's what we discover in this process is that within being still and quiet, things are still, your heartbeat, everything's still going, but also your mind is still going. So it's not that there is no activity, it's that there is no self-activity, identity activity. So it means that when we rest, we actually we're allowing to rest this sort of thing that is always running.
The self.
Which is the self, which is the sense of self, which is always wants to do something, always wants to have results for something. And so that's what's resting. But actually our lives continues. And in fact, it continues when we sit in Zazen, our life continues. The day changes from night to day. And if you sit all night long, it'll change to the next morning. So our life continues in a way, but we can't sit all day long. So therefore we kind of, so the way to embody its stillness and activity is to sit Zazen. And through Zazen or meditation, or in this meditation specifically, is to begin to really deepen our understanding that we can pause. We can actually just by observing, we pause that mechanism of sense of needing and feeling unfulfilled. And Zazen is one of those Dharma gates that we realize that things don't actually stop, but what pauses is that part of ourselves that is always exhausted, that is tired at the end of the day, and to really look deeply at that.
So one, through Zazen practice, one will need the inclination towards drowsiness will decrease because you're being more still during the day.
One of my teachers said, even if you get tired, even if we're sitting 14, I remember this, even if we're sitting 15 hours a day, and you're tired for 10 of them, you're going to be awake for 5. Eventually that'll go away. Eventually your tiredness will go away. So
patience. So this next question is really good. Is non-clinging the goal in Zazen or part of the goal, or is it some type of knowledge or understanding? And I would just add to that, is it the path? Is non-clinging the goal? Is it the path, or is it just part of the goal?
So we've been emphasizing a lot of Zazen, and I think people are just curious about it, but Zazen at its core is hard to describe. It isn't something that we can actually put into a box, because what I think that Zazen that we're talking about right now and that I'm actually describing is the sitting posture. But until now, did I say sitting posture? And I think I've been saying sitting in quiet and silence. But the Zazen that we're talking about, that is being talked about, is the Zazen that exists at the core of our being. It doesn't come nor go. But through the upright sitting posture, we connect with it directly. But once we connect with it directly, actually that very mind that is connected to that Zazen that's sitting upright in stillness and quiet is the very mind that cooks for your kids, goes and puts gas in the car, goes and gets groceries, goes and bows to the Buddha. That Zazen mind is the one that the Zazen posture, and this is not just even Japanese. This comes from dhyana. This comes from the Indian word dhyana. So it's not somehow, just Japanese. This is throughout the history of Buddhism, that this posture is the direct connection to that very mind. So yes, we're talking about the relational aspect of sitting zazen to the mind and what we do with it, but actually the relationship between the sitting posture and everyday activity also, which doesn't have a beginning or end usually.
And this is not just theoretical. Zenshin Dillon also has a daughter, 2.5, something. Yeah. So yeah, and it's pretty cool actually to watch you parent. So go to another question, somewhat more about engaged practice. So Venerable, do you minister to patients of all faiths or just the Buddhist patients?
So yeah, that's a great question. So when we train, we study we study not in a lot of depth, but we do study to some degree the major religions of the world. And so as a Buddhist chaplain, I see I visit different patients with different faiths. So that's the most succinct way that I can answer that question. So no, it's all different faiths, and I know a little bit about different religions. So therefore, I can even, interesting enough, I can pray with a Christian, and then I can go and pray with a Muslim next door, if that's the type of hospital or clinic. So.
Or with students here.
Here.
Yeah.
So it I can say that I would love to know more about. I would like to know more about and really spend a lot more time studying the various religions. But I think going back to the original sentiment is that, or original core of meeting patients and people in care and needing of care, is that the core of it is connectivity, inclusion, straightforwardness, and care. And so if we can really hone that into a deep listening practice, I think that you can probably see that doesn't have necessarily a religion. It's more connecting with the human being that is in front of us.
The next question is it's beyond just practice with engagement. It's practice with being married. So gone past the engagement phase. I think I heard that you were married. If so, how does marriage relationship affect your practice?
It really is. It's a different facet of the jewel. It's just a different side of the jewel within Indra's net. It's a different perspective of practice, but at its sort of essential, it's the practice itself. So there's various ways that we can talk about that, but I think that the nature of it is still within the realm of care, compassion, kindness, and equanimity.
Openness, inclusiveness, and
that's the way that's the way that I'm sort of translating the four boundless hearts. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but essentially is connecting with a person and a family in this sense at that place, at that interconnection, at that place of vow. And so there is no one way to look at that. Each person will encounter that in different ways, depending on how they take on the Buddhist teachings and the Buddhist practices. And so this is just my experience.
And it helps that your wife is a practitioner and a meditator as well.
So she's also practices, and so of course that aligns more with a cohesion in some sense of practicing together. I mean, there's still challenges, there's still things that we need to work out, but with that as its basis, then you can imagine that there's a lot more understanding potentially, and maybe even flexibility around hey, I need to go study, or I need to do these things. And I think there's a lot of understanding, or at least we try to we try to understand.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much. We've really only skimmed the surface, but fortunately, at least for this evening, we'll have more chances to interact with Dylan. Dylan's going to stick around for the Zoom session. I just put the Zoom link in the show notes. So there was at least 1 or 2 questions that we didn't get to. So hopefully people who have those thoughts can come over to Zoom and just click on that link, and we'll see you over there in just a moment. And for everyone else, Ajahn Nisabo is, I think, 1 or 2 weeks, 1.5 weeks into his 3-month winter retreat, but he's still coming on alms round. Most every day you want to check the alms calendar in case he's fasting, but we'll be doing alms round and coming in to teach as normal on Saturdays. So, and next week we'll actually be interviewing Aya Santusika and Aya Chitananda. So you can come back live for that, and wish everyone well. And Zenshin Dillon, thank you very much. All right.